All right, ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to be dissecting a case that I think really captured the whole nation's attention. The disappearance and murder of Gabby Petito. You guys remember this one, right? This seemingly perfect van life, like adventure, turned into this tragic mystery, and it like all played out on social media.
Yeah, for sure. I think this one really gripped everybody. And because so much of it was, so public, it felt like we were all kind of like armchair detectives trying to piece together the puzzle along with, the real investigators.
Totally. So let's rewind a little bit. Gabby Petito and her fiance, Brian Laundrie, they set off on this cross-country road trip in a converted van, right? And they're documenting their whole journey online. We have Gabby, who's like this bubbly personality, had these travel influencer dreams. And then you have Brian, who's, a little more introverted, kind of like an artist.
Yeah, and I think on the surface, it looked like the ultimate dream, exploring the national parks, like just living this carefree, like free-spirited life. But when we look back, there were definitely some like cracks in that perfect facade from the very beginning.
Okay, so before we get into all the like nitty-gritty details, can you give us a quick overview of like how this case actually unfolded? Like, how did it start and how did it end?
For sure. So they embarked on their trip in July of 2021, and initially everything seemed fine, at least online. But then in August, things took a turn. There was a police encounter in Moab, Utah, and a witness had called 911 reporting like a domestic dispute, and police body camera footage showed a visibly distraught Gabby and Brian, who was very calm, almost dismissive,
Yeah, that footage was really, really tough to watch, and I think it definitely raised red flags for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, definitely. But at the time, the police categorized it as like a mental health crisis, and they just separated them for the night. No arrests were made. But then, just a few weeks later, Brian returned to Florida alone, driving Gabby's van, and Gabby's family reported her missing. That's when, the nationwide search started.
And that's when it really, exploded, right?
Like, it felt like everyone was following every update, sharing theories online, just completely consumed by this case.
It was a media frenzy, for sure. And the mystery deepened when Brian, the last person to see Gabby alive, refused to cooperate with the investigation and then disappeared himself.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we've got this, big picture view now, but let's put on our detective hats and break down how the investigators pieced together, what happened, starting with that incident in Moab.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a crucial piece of the puzzle. The body cam footage from that encounter, it gave investigators, really valuable insight into the dynamics of their relationship. You could see Gabby was visibly upset, while Brian appeared very detached and evasive. And you mentioned that the police, labeled it as a mental health crisis, right? Looking back now, do you think that was the right call?
It's really tough to say for sure. The officers on the scene, they had very limited information, and they made a judgment call based on what they observed at that moment. But, it does highlight how complex it is to respond to these types of situations, especially when emotions are running so high.
Yeah, it's so easy to look back now and be like, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that, But I can definitely see how it was a tough situation for law enforcement to navigate in the moment.
Exactly. And this is why it's so important for everyone to be able to recognize the signs of potential domestic abuse. And we're not just talking about physical violence, but also emotional manipulation and controlling behavior.
Right. Absolutely. So the Moab incident, while not initially seen as this, huge turning point, became a really key piece of evidence for investigators. What happened next in this timeline?
So after Moab, they continued their trip. But communication with Gabby's family became more and more sporadic. Her last Instagram post was on August 25th. And then silence.
Wow, that must have been incredibly alarming for her family.
It was. They knew something was terribly wrong. And then on September 1st, Brian returned to Florida alone in Gabby's van. He refused to talk to the police or Gabby's family. And a few days later, he vanished too.
Oh, wow. So now you have this missing woman, a silent fiance who has also gone missing, and a family that is refusing to cooperate with police. It's just a perfect recipe for a media frenzy.
Yeah.
So what did investigators do next?
Well, they really had their work cut out for them. First they had to focus on retracing Gabby and Brian's steps, using their social media posts, credit card records, witness accounts, all that to map their movements. And remember, this is all happening under such huge public scrutiny. So every new detail was making headlines.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It was the whole country was just glued to their phones, waiting for updates constantly.
So do you think that public attention actually helped or hurt the investigation?
It's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, that massive attention, it brought in like a flood of tips and potential leads. But on the other hand, it also created a lot of noise and speculation, which made it a lot harder for investigators to sift through and figure out the actual facts.
Right, right. So, okay, look, investigators are sifting through all this information. They're trying to track down 2 missing people. What was their breakthrough moment?
The turning point was on September 19th, when Gabby's remains were found in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. And that discovery, it totally shifted the entire focus of the investigation.
Yeah, that must have been just devastating for Gabby's family and friends, finally getting confirmation, but obviously not the outcome that anyone was hoping for. Absolutely. And for investigators, it shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation because the autopsy revealed that Gabby had died by manual strangulation.
Oh, wow. That's a chilling detail. Can you talk about why that's so significant?
Well, strangulation, unlike other methods of assault, is often seen as a more personal and intimate act of violence. And it kind of suggests a really high level of rage and control on the part of the perpetrator.
So at this point, Brian's the prime suspect in a homicide. The pressure to find him must have been immense.
Oh, for sure. It was a total race against time. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were now involved in this huge manhunt. They were following every single lead, chasing every tip, and searching vast wilderness areas.
And this whole time, Brian's family, they stayed silent, right?
Right. Their lack of cooperation, it really fueled public suspicion and frustration. A lot of people were just outraged that they weren't providing information that could help find their son, who is now a fugitive.
Yeah, I can understand why people were so angry.
Yeah.
But from an investigator standpoint, how does a family's silence like that impact a case?
It can make things incredibly difficult. In any investigation, witness testimony and cooperation from those closest to the individuals involved is so, so valuable. When that's missing, it's like this void that investigators have to try to fill.
They're trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, right?
It is.
So the search for Brian continues, but did they have any leads at all?
Yeah, there were a couple of promising leads. They discovered that Brian had purchased a burner phone very shortly after returning to Florida, and they also learned that he had left his cell phone and wallet at his parents' house before he disappeared. And these actions, they kind of suggested that he was really actively trying to avoid detection.
Yeah, that's some pretty incriminating behavior, even if you're trying to give him, the benefit of the doubt.
It definitely raised eyebrows. And then there was another significant development. Brian's parents reported him missing.
Wait, what? So after weeks of silence, they suddenly report their son is missing. That's so strange.
Yeah, very strange. They told police they hadn't seen him since September 14th after he'd gone for a hike in a nearby nature reserve.
So now investigators are searching for Brian in this vast nature reserve. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, it was an incredibly challenging search, that's for sure. The terrain was difficult, and there were just so many potential hiding places.
And all the while, the public is still watching, analyzing every single move, right?
Oh, yeah. Social media was buzzing with theories and speculation. Amateur sleuths were poring over maps and timelines and satellite images, just trying to, do whatever they could to help find Brian.
It's so interesting how, technology and social media have totally changed the way these investigations happen. Do you think that all that public involvement actually helped or hurt the search for Brian?
It's hard to say for sure. There have definitely been cases where tips from the public have led to huge breakthroughs. But in this particular instance, it's really hard to say if all the public attention actually directly contributed to finding Brian.
Okay, so the search continues, but eventually it came to an end, right?
Right. On October 20th, Brian's remains were found in the nature reserve. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Just a really tragic end to a tragic story.
Mm-hmm.
But did his death bring any closure to the case at all?
In some ways, yes, but in other ways, it just raised even more questions.
Like what happened during those missing weeks? What was he doing?
Exactly, and what was Brian thinking?
Yeah.
What was going on in his head? Unfortunately, we may never know the full story.
So Brian is dead, Gabby is dead. Case closed.
Not quite. You see, alongside Brian's remains, investigators found a backpack and a notebook. And inside that notebook, a confession.
A confession. He finally admits to killing Gabby after all this time.
Yeah. In his own words, he detailed how he had strangled Gabby during an argument. He claimed that it was an accident, that it happened in the heat of the moment, but...
Wow. So a confession, but one that comes too late for any legal proceedings.
Exactly. Brian's death meant that he could never be tried in court. But, I mean, the confession did provide some answers for Gabby's family. It helps bring a sense of resolution, even though it was obviously a heartbreaking one.
It's hard to imagine what that must have been like for them, to learn about that confession, to have that confirmation, but also that anger and grief, knowing that they'll never be able to, face Brian in court.
Yeah, it's unimaginable, and it really just highlights how complex the justice system can be. Sometimes even when the truth is revealed, there's no real sense of closure.
And what about Brian's parents? Did they face any legal consequences for their silence and their lack of cooperation?
That's a question a lot of people had. While their actions were, ethically questionable in a lot of people's eyes, they didn't actually break any laws by refusing to speak to the police or share information about their son's whereabouts.
So legally, they were in the clear.
Yeah.
But their silence, it really damaged their public image and fueled so much anger and suspicion towards them.
Absolutely. And it brings up this bigger issue of moral responsibility versus legal obligation, because there are definitely times when doing what's right might not line up with what's legally required.
And it's a tough thing to think about. But for the investigators, that confession, even though it came after Brian's death, was still a crucial piece of evidence.
Oh, absolutely. It corroborated the physical evidence that was found at the crime scene, and it provided a lot of context for the events that led up to Gabby's death.
Yeah, so even though Brian's confession came after his death, it helped solidify the case against him. But it's weird how even with a confession, we're still left with so many unanswered questions.
Oh, yeah. That's totally the nature of these kinds of cases. We can look at all the evidence and piece together a timeline, but we're never going to really know what was going on in his head, his real motivations, or what his state of mind was at the time,
It's like we have this, puzzle with some pieces missing. Mm. And it's definitely frustrating, but it also really makes you think. Mm. And, beyond just the legal aspects of this case, I think it sparked a lot of really important conversations about so many bigger issues.
Absolutely. It definitely brought the issue of domestic violence to the forefront, how it can be happening right in front of us and we don't even realize it. And it showed us how crucial it is to be able to recognize those red flags early on.
Right. And Gabby's carefully crafted online persona, it just really contrasted with the reality of what was going on in her relationship. I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people to be more aware and critical of what they're seeing online,
For sure. It's easy to get caught up in everyone's highlight reel on social media, but we have to remember that, people only show you what they want you to see. It's not always the full picture.
And in this case also brought up a lot of discussion about, missing white woman syndrome, right? The idea that these cases involving, young, attractive white women get way more media coverage and attention than cases involving people of color or people from marginalized communities.
Yeah, and it's a valid point for sure. I mean, Gabby's case got so much attention, which, did help expedite the investigation, I think. But it also makes you wonder, why do some cases resonate with the public more than others? Why do some stories get told while others get ignored?
Yeah, it's really complex, and it's a conversation that we need to keep having for sure. So looking back on this whole case, what do you think are the biggest takeaways, both for investigators and, for us, the public?
Well, for investigators, I think this case showed how vital it is to have thorough documentation, really meticulous evidence collection, and to use all the technology that we have available now. I mean, think about it. The use of social media, digital footprints, forensic analysis, all of that played a huge role in putting the pieces together.
Right. And for the public, what do you think we should take away from all of this?
For the public, I think it's a huge reminder that domestic violence can happen to anyone, no matter your background, your social status, or how perfect your life might look online. We have to learn to recognize the warning signs and speak up if we see something that seems off. And if you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out for help. You don't have to go through this alone.
Those are really powerful takeaways, and I think Gabby's story, even though it's incredibly tragic, it can have a positive impact. If we learn from this and try to prevent similar things from happening in the future, then maybe something good can come from it.
I completely agree. Her story reminds us to be more aware, more compassionate, and to actively work towards creating a world where everyone feels safe and supported.
Well, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the Gabby Petito case. Thanks for joining us, guys.
It's been a really important conversation, and if anything we talked about today has resonated with you or brought up any concerns, please remember that there are resources available to help. You're not alone.